Good afternoon. My name is Brandon Maxwell. We're going to take a quick look at our article presentation, Propaganda in Wartime Communication. The article specifically is titled, Who Uses Internet Propaganda in Civil Wars and Why? This first appeared in the Journal of Peace Research in October of 2024, so a relatively recent study. This was conducted by Dr. Barbara Walter and Dr. Gregory Phillips. So the case for conducting this study, the topic, this article explored who was likely to benefit from the internet propaganda in Civil War, and after a fairly lengthy discussion and analysis of certain key criteria that we'll talk about here shortly, the authors close out the article by discussing the potential implications that new media environment could have over civil wars. Here, and I think why this is important is they've identified a few key things that were important around how social media may be reshaping civil wars. The first would be lowering barriers to entry and new and external actors. Secondly, empowering extremists and the transitional groups. And then third, undermining the traditional advantages of locally rooted factions. So making it more difficult for local small factions to begin and favoring more global international factions. There were three hypotheses that were discussed in the article, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll discuss just the third one. Newer rebel groups are more likely to rely on internet propaganda than older, more established factions. And then here, the research methodology was more quantitative in nature versus qualitative. The authors reviewed numerous articles as their data set, specifically content from the Iraqi Civil War over a 4-year period from 2011 to 2015. They were pulling from various online sources and downloadable media, things like PDFs, videos, and magazine articles. Here we notice that their digital disruption was social media was kind of the theory that they were discussing. So the authors argued that the internet, especially social media, reshapes how rebel groups overcome key organizational challenges. And they can be varied challenges from recruiting to messaging and just rallying people around their cause. Here, again, the third hypothesis around newer rebel groups using them internet propaganda more widely than established factions. There were really key findings out of that hypothesis. The first would be, in fact, that newer groups were using internet propaganda more frequently and readily than established groups. Newer groups produced more content, nearly twice as much content as their older peer groups, including nearly 3 times as much video content. Then the established newer groups leaned heavily on social media to grow their following and to build credibility for their cause. What the authors do well, I think they did a really good job in providing a clear set of objectives. So it was very clear what I was reading, why I was reading it, and what their hopeful outcome was from that study. They also set to and stuck to a well-designed timeline of review. So they kept their focus in a very specific time, in a very specific region, not globally, not over the 20-year period. So I felt like the data, the time period under review was very manageable. I think they also provided a thorough set of references and footnotes. So if we want to continue reading, look into this further for our own, we were able to do so very easily just from this article. And I think they also made a solid connection of the traditional view of application of social media use as outlined how that may impact civil war. So I think they did a really good job of articulating that. And then next, kind of they could have done maybe a little bit better. I think it would have been nice to have and included other regions or factions in this group. It was very hyper specific, which was also something that I felt that they did well. But if you really wanted to get into the topic, they could have done a little bit deeper, I think. Well, I thought it was interesting in a detailed study. Most of the analysis was based on patterns of publication. So the number of times a faction would post in a month versus actual hard evidence or proof. I was also left wondering what other data might exist. So they were looking at official documentation versus unofficial. It'll be interesting to see how that might have varied between the two. And then also just what applications might they find that weren't on traditional sites, maybe something from hidden sites or things that are a bit more difficult to find than a faction's kind of authorized social media presence. My personal learnings from this, basically everything that I've just discussed. I had no pre-knowledge of this topic at all. So everything I've learned about this was as a result of this assignment and this reading in this article. I'm learned that extremist groups have adopted social media very much in a way a sophisticated organization that you and I might work for. It's very fascinating how they've brought in some of those same philosophies, those same practices to advantage their efforts around civil war. The other part that I thought was really fascinating too is that military intervention as a result of these propaganda movements using social media have increased from 4% from 1991 up to 40% during the studies period ending in 2021. So that was very fascinating to me. Here are the references. If you'd like to go and find additional readings for yourself, you'll be able to do that. This was again the source of the article in the Journal of Peace and Research. Thanks, and I hope you have a great day.